Good evening and welcome to I believe, our 7th budget workshop dated Thursday, March 29th. We have one more scheduled currently, which will be next Thursday, April 5th. Thank you, we've switched it a couple times. So thank you for coming here tonight. We're at a point tonight where we're going to receive a little more information, I believe, from Perry Schwartz about facility studies, and then we have some adjustments to the overall budget, and then we will continue from there.
Looks like we have a number of public here as well, so we want to know when they're participating.
Okay, and we do have members of the public here, which we're really happy to see. We're going to allow you to address the board at the beginning with anything you might want to share, and afterwards, John, if you wouldn't mind giving just a recap to the public of our process in a nutshell.
Sure.
So, thank you. And I guess I'm going to say also, I'm going to welcome questions at the end of the budget workshop as well. So if anybody would like to begin now, you're free to address the podium and say your name and address.
Anyone from the public who'd like to speak at this time?
No? Okay. All right, so seeing nobody is ready right now, I will open it up towards the end again if anybody has thoughts afterwards. So John, if you don't mind just giving
Sure.
a brief recap of our process and where we stand right now.
So to give a brief recap of our process, we sort of talked a little bit about, first of all, what's in the school budget and the different pressures that shape the school budget, and how that's reported, and talked about some things that are required and some things that you do for, you're trying to figure out how each piece relates to improving the education of the students in your school. We then talked about what portion of our budget is subject to long-term contracts, and it's been pretty steady and rising somewhat. It's around 80% right now. And those are, we can determine, the administrators can determine how many of different types of employees that you have, but once you have those employees, almost all of them are under labor agreements that are long-term contracts that have set raises and benefits to them, and those are not part of the budget, they are already negotiated. So those tend to rise a little bit every year, like everyone. We're not different than anybody else, but that's something you might not understand immediately when you see all the line items in the budget. And we've risen to about a little over 80% of our current costs are in those long-term contracts. So we have a lot less room to move costs. So those go up a few percent every year, which means if you keep a flat head count, your costs are still going to rise. So we also went through how we staff our schools, what type of personnel are there, what type of classroom teachers, and the variety of different personnel that you have in a school to make it function really well, in terms of taking care of the school, in terms of making sure kids are ready and available to learn, to help your struggling learners, to help your most talented learners, to really make sure that you're delivering a quality education for all. We sort of went through the details of that. We went through some of the number counts. We're expecting our student population to essentially be flat. It was virtually flat last year and the few years before. We've been at 1,600 plus or minus 5 students for about 3 years running now. This year, within our budget, we take everything together. Our head counts for all staff, I believe, are also flat. There's 0 change in the total head counts. Although I think that may be up 1 now, because we're adding, although it's being funded through a grant, we're adding a social worker to the middle school, so the head count will go up by 1, but that's actually funded externally. So flat student population, relatively flat head count, and then our non-personnel costs, I believe, are also virtually flat. They were around 80,000 when we first did it. I think they're probably a little bit under that now. My guess is somewhere around, really close to no change, I would guess, given the recent additions. One of them will go into the contract numbers, and the rest of them will be in the other numbers. So I think we're probably a little bit down, actually, on our total costs
Yeah.
that are non-personnel related costs. So we've got a reduction in non-personnel related costs, a small, total 4.2%, I believe. Well, it's maybe a little more than that now because we have
It's about, it's just over 4%.
just over 4%
4.4
in terms of
possibly.
labor cost increase. And so we wanted to go through and explain where our money goes and how our staff our schools. We talked also about the physical plant and the capital projects that we have on. We also touched upon a recent look at what sorts of significant improvements the buildings may need, and talked about an architectural study that we looked at that is not currently in the budget. We talked a lot about a few things that were not in the budget, and that's one of the significant ones. We identified probably well over $20 million, $25 million in significant improvements to our buildings, and an architectural study that would have been about 800,000, was it 700,000?
Close to
760, you mean?
Yeah, about $760,000 to take to the next level where you could get the detail necessary to begin the bond process. That is not currently in our budget. This is just, it's a challenging year to do that. We struggle with how we're going to handle things like those one-time costs like that, and manage our physical plant, because our physical plant, as we've said before, these are, the buildings are not getting to be buildings that we're particularly proud of at this point. There are some significant issues that affect learning. We don't have the, redundancy in our systems. It's like, so when we have power loss, the schools are shut entirely. We've had internet, those are examples of how thin our infrastructure is. So we've arrived at this budget through a series of sort of talking to our administrators and looking at what we can do, and we've had some recent adjustments to the budget. We're gonna get some updates on those this evening. We went through looking at what's not in the budget, what new things that are in the budget. Talked a little bit also about some of the savings that people have found along the way earlier on. But that's where we stand right now. We're looking at a budget right now that is about up on a baseline basis 3.2%, which is pretty consistent. We've managed our budget within a very relatively narrow range of costs. The challenges we have much less control over on the funding side. The state subsidy for education in Cape Elizabeth is up substantially, is down substantially this year, related to changes in the funding formula, where they changed what the state requires you to spend on education, but did not fund all of that. That results in a raise to the expected mill rate for every town. And when you raise the mill rate for a town like Cape Elizabeth, that's a big number, so the expected contribution is up substantially. In addition, good news for everybody who owns a home out there, our property values are up, and so they do, every year they update their valuations, unlike the town who only does a revaluation every 5 or 10 years or so. Our property values are up, so you take that mill rate that's increased, and you take that increase in property valuation, and you have a significantly increased expected local contribution. You flow that through the state funding formula, and you have the third substantial cut in a row to Cape Elizabeth's state funding. It's down about 62% over 3 years. Meanwhile, our student populations have been dead flat. So we've lost 400,000, 800,000, and about 900,000 this year. So that's 3 years of subsequent cuts. And so that's what we're trying to wrestle with right now. And I will quote from the last time we sort of presented our budget to the town council, when we sort of looked at how little our budget was changing and how little our student population is changing and how much the state funding changes over the period. And the town manager, Matt, to his credit, looked at the graphs and said, you don't really have a spending problem, you have a funding problem, and that's where we stand today. And so we're sort of now wrestling with the discussion tonight about what do we think we can afford, what does it look like, and what are we staying for in terms of funding education here in Cape Elizabeth. So
Thank you, John.
that's where we've been.
Thank you. So Perry, are you prepared to just go over some of the things that we received from you on Tuesday?
Yes,
Yeah, thank you.
and I can be as brief or as detailed as you want.
I'll start off brief, and if you have any questions, just let me know. I had received some questions from the school board, and I'm just gonna read through them and give you a brief description of how things are laid out within the facilities department. The first question was, how many custodians and maintenance staff does Cape Elizabeth Schools employ? We have 18 custodians full, in our full capacity. 4 of them are on day shift, and the remainder is on the night shift. We have 4 maintenance personnel that work the day shift. 2 office staff, 1 being an administrative assistant and 1 being the transportation scheduler. And then myself is the department summed up outside of transportation. The second question was, how does it break out by town and school? I'm going to come back to that. The third question was, does this idea of sharing personnel and cooperation between town and school work? At this current time, our staff is too small to comfortably cover this workload and continually maintain the desired services. We do a lot of juggling around and bringing in extra support to try to meet the needs of both the town and the school together. And a lot of it could be due to just the scheduling of board meetings, sporting events. The pool's open till 9:30 at night. 3 days out of the week, the library's open to a late hour. So there's a lot of juggling around in how we manipulate staff to fill the needs of both entities. I have here some questions that I submitted to my peers, other facility directors. I believe there's 1 business manager. In schools, I believe it was a total of 16 that I got responses from schools within the state. And the first question that I asked him was, does your school district have help from the town public works for clearing snow, mowing fields, and general grounds work? Approximately 85% said no, they do not share these services with the town. 15% do. Does the town and the school share custodial and maintenance services? 88% do not share custodial and maintenance services. 12% do. And the third question was, if the town and the school share these services in any way, from question 1 or 2, is there a bill generated between the identities, or is it just figured into tax dollars? I attached all the emails that I received. There's kind of a mix on that and those questions and how they explained the way they do it. I would say the majority of them do not generate a bill. But because some of them get technical, because some of the services could be subbed out to a contractor, and some they share within the department. So you pretty much have to read through the emails to get an answer on that.
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you said most of them don't generate a bill, what does that mean? Does it mean that just the town covers it, so there's no need to submit a bill? Is that what you're saying, or is it something else?
They don't do a physical, this is a bill for our services.
Uh-huh.
It's just similar to what we do here. It's on paper. And the transaction happens within the, Catherine can explain that more. But, yeah, there's not a physical bill issued.
Okay, all right.
And then to answer question number 2 on how it breaks out or how that looks, there is a sheet on the back of the packet where I've tried to simplify it and lay it out as best as I could. I don't know how much you want me to go through with this. I have highlighted in red where the juggling between our custodial staff and how we handle both town and school with those particular employees. It is quite a juggling act, and a lot of them hopping in a car, running to this building, running to that building, and trying to, and where it all comes down is everybody meets at the pool at the end of the night. and tries to knock the pool out after they've closed at 9:30. I did receive some other questions, I think, from another meeting that was asking, and this kind of goes with the chart. We have a total of 14 custodians on night shift. If we're fully staffed, nobody's called out sick, it's a A+ night, we have 14 custodians here. They are split between the high school, Pond Cove, and the middle school, and also 5 town buildings. In order to meet the needs of both the town and school, we're looking at a total of 12 custodians would be needed to handle just the school buildings alone. That would be 5 custodians in the high school, I have it written as 3.5 custodians in the middle school and 3.5 custodians in the Pond Cove. What we'd be looking at is there would be 1 custodian that would share kind of both sides. And then for the town, we're looking at a total of 4 custodians. Right now, the town pays us for 3 custodians. So it would be an increase of 1 custodian on both sides to be really where we need to be staff-wise.
And Perry, on the school side, you said it was 12?
Yes.
Does that not include the pool?
That does not include the pool, no. I've tried to separate the town buildings and sat down with Janet for quite a while today, and we really had to kind of play this through roles of how this would look, you know, with the amount of people and how we would juggle them around. You know, for instance, we have an employee that handles the community center for a few hours and the police department for a few hours. That actually works. I mean, that is something that after or during his first break for the night, he goes from the police department to the community center, which schedule-wise works out great. It's perfect, so we wouldn't want to change something like that. Where town hall isn't necessarily a full 8-hour position, and neither is the library. They'd be more around the 5 or 6 hours to do those buildings. And the plan would be to then, those 2 employees would come down to the pool and assist 1 single person that would handle the pool at the end of the night. And it would also, it would allow for coverage that if somebody was out sick or something like that, we would have that coverage to, so there wouldn't be any stealing from the school side or anything like that.
Lester?
Yeah, when people are swapping between buildings, hopefully every building has its own equipment, and the equipment is not being transferred back and forth?
No, it is not.
Okay, that's-
They have their own equipment.
So I appreciate the breakdown, Perry, very much. And I think, my feeling has been that it would be very helpful, you know, if we separated, in this one instance, in terms of a one-town concept, if we separated the custodians, those who only serve the schools and those who only serve town buildings. Because one, it allows us to track better, you know,
Right.
how well are all the, you know, the jobs that need to get done, getting done? Do we have any excess, or do we need more? I
Right.
think when you're trying to figure it out between 2 buildings, or 2 entities, it's harder to track that. And then the other thing, and you touched on this, was it's not as efficient. It's
No.
not as efficient to have people going from building to building, even if their supplies are still in the buildings. You know, there's lost time there, and maybe it's not a whole custodian worth of, you know, an 8-hour shift worth of lost time, but there is lost time.
Yes.
And so I think, you know, the prudent thing would be to divide, to separate the custodian workload, and we're able to track it better that way going forward.
Yeah, and I am looking, I was talking with Noel the other day about tracking them time-wise to make sure everything's accounted for, where the town buildings, we're okay on the schools, but the town buildings would have separate time clocks where they can scan their ID card, and it would track, you know, are we exceeding the amount of time we should be in those buildings, or are we to the good, so.
Thank you. So thank you. We don't have the extra custodians that you're saying we could use in the budget, just to be clear.
Correct.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Just, thank you. Well, I think in the future, in the near future, when we speak with town council, I would like to think that this is something that would be considered, even though it's not in the budget currently.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I think next, I don't know, Catherine or Howard want to update the numbers for us, or?
Sure. Well, I was about to say I'd be happy to, but it's not good, a message. We were notified by our insurance company, the MEA Benefits Trust, that our rates for next year came in, and they came in at an increase of 8.76%, which is higher than what we budgeted. We budgeted 8%. Luckily, it's not a lot higher, so the increase to the budget was $23,795 because of that. But one of the sheets that I handed out, and that is also on the round table in the corner, is one that says at the top 2018-2019 budget changes, and it listed all the changes that I had done to the budget from the original printout. So there were some budget corrections that need to be made. Some accounts the amount was inputted incorrectly, and luckily those were actually less than what my error was, so we had several of those, thank goodness. We did have one contract settle. It's not fully ratified, but it is settled, so I figured I updated the salary and benefit accounts for that contract change. That was only $527, but hey, it's better than nothing. And then also, we no longer need to pay for the tuition for the Portland Arts and Technology High School, so we were able to take that out of the budget, and that was $77,000. So it did reduce the budget expenditures we were at an increase of 3.5, we're now at an increase of 3.2, but that only affected the tax rate, which was at 10.8, it's now at 10.4. So that leads me to one of the other sheets that I handed out tonight. It's headed Examples of Budget Reduction on Tax Rate for the 2018-19 school year. And what this sheet shows you, the very first box on the left, it's headed Restated Budget after March 29th, 2018 changes. So that shows you how the budget change dropped a little bit with those changes that I just pointed out. And the next three boxes show you how much we'd have to cut to get to a lower tax rate. If we want to get to a tax rate of 9%, we need to cut to approximately $285,000. If we wanted to get to a tax increase of 7%, we'd need to cut approximately $725,000. If we want to get to a tax increase of 5.5%, we'd need to cut over $1 million. And because of what we do is very labor intensive, the majority of our budget is staff. 80% of our budget is staff. That to get down to cuts that large, we have to cut people, and that is not ideal. So, and the last sheet that I handed out is headed Comparative Schools Budget and Tax Rate Increases. So, I did poll or get the information from the surrounding towns and other towns that we compare ourselves to. And so this shows how Cape Elizabeth, at this time, this was before I made those budget changes, we had an increase of 3.5, which, as you can see, looking at the other towns, really is not unrealistic. It was relatively reasonable. But you can see how our large drop in subsidy really hit us hard compared to other surrounding towns. So we thought this would be a good informational item to put out there.
Do you have a question?
No, thank you. I did, I don't have to change my mind.
So, just to, I guess, just to go over the change in the healthcare, we regularly, every year, budget, because we don't know until now what the number is, but we regularly budget 8%, and that's always been pretty
Safe.
safe.
Yeah.
It's been a safe bet, year after year, and as I understand it, like, what was it last year? It was,
We had an increase of 1.88% last year, and the
So-
year before that, there was no increase.
so, I mean, this is a huge difference from what we have typically ended up with. So this is a big disappointment for us, because we were hoping that it would come in under 8, so we would have some additional reductions to the budget, but that is not the case. So I just, and the reason for the increase is what? I don't quite understand.
It's experience of those who are insured in our district.
Uh-huh.
We're a large enough district where we're our own group.
Mhm.
And the experience rating of our employees overall is cost a good deal more this year, which no one should apologize for.
Uh-huh.
There's just been the need.
Right.
And a few very expensive health situations have, I mean, insurance companies are all about making profits. And
Right.
when they see that there is a cost spiking, they're going to increase their premiums. Now, that's what's happened.
Right. And so the flip side of that is, you're right, nobody needs to apologize for that, because the flip side has been, the reason we've had such good rates has been because we've had a very healthy, community, and people who take care of each other, take care of themselves. So it's a shame that, 1 year, where there's always gonna be an exceptional year, that's the way the system works, it's a shame, I think.
I agree.
Can I ask a question? Just for, I think a lot of us were hoping that when the insurance percentage came back, that there would be a reduction to the percentage in the budget. And, I'm just wondering, if it had come back around 1.5 or 2%, how much money would that have been? Are we talking $10,000?
No.
Are we talking $100,000? Are we talking $500,000? I mean,
Well,
just for perspective here of what we, as we were budgeting this and hoping for, and once again, have not been able to attain.
Right. As you can see, the increase of basically 0.75 was 25,000. So
Right.
you could kind of say that
So hundreds of thousands.
if it came down to 1 or 2%, it could be as much as a couple hundred
So,
max. Yeah.
so if this had been like years past, like we had been thinking, we would have had hundreds of thousands of dollars savings
Yeah.
that we don't get right now,
Correct.
which is huge. It's like
Yeah.
a huge blow, much like the lack of the money from the state that we didn't get.
It's kicking us while we're down.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think that's important to understand.
Yes, definitely.
So, on that, as a reminder, we've also drawn down our unassigned funds
Right.
to its lowest level in many years, and is going to sort of dip precariously low until the end of the audit, when we hope we will be back at a minimum or around 250, but it will dip substantially below that in the meantime. Yep.
I think to explain, I would like,
Yeah.
if I may, to explain that a little bit, is that this is the 3rd year in a row that we've had a substantial cut in state aid. So when the first year of a substantial cut, we drew down the undesignated fund balance, which we had at a pretty healthy amount, so that we could mitigate the tax impact. We got an even deeper cut from the state last year, and we really drew down that undesignated fund balance, and it's like a savings account that it doesn't build back up at the rate that we have been pulling this money out because we've had to. And so because we had to pull so much out last year, because we had a similar cut, we're not starting with that same savings account balance. We are starting from a much lower point, and we are dipping dangerously low. And the wish would be that we had that, but because we keep getting cut every single year, and every single year we keep trying to minimize that tax impact, we find ourselves here.
Yeah, and I would like to think of that as we have no backup, right? We don't have any tricks in our pocket to pull out and help save the money somewhere else. It comes to the taxpayers and a higher tax or major cuts. I mean, there's nothing else, no other tricks to find money anywhere else
Similarly, our contingency,
at our level.
our contingency account is at quite a low level as well. And we've had that, we'd like to have that up larger. We have no reserve for things like out-of-district placements or special education reserve funds in many districts. It's basically, we can handle one small thing and maybe one person if we have to. That's about it.
And I also want to add that, you know, it's not that we haven't been careful with our savings. We haven't necessarily been, you know, irresponsible with our contingency fund. We have been asked in the past, within the past 3 years, to, you know, reduce the number. And so the only way we can reduce it without impacting services is to draw from our undesignated funds.
By the number, you mean the tax impact?
Yeah, by the number, I mean, because what has mattered to, maybe I'll just stop there, but it just seems that, I just want to clarify that it's not that we like, oh, we've got money, we can spend it this way. No, we've been basically forced to match a certain percentage of taxpayer payment, and without any other resources other than what we have available. And now we're at the point, as people are saying, that, you know, this time next year, we're gonna have, if we're lucky, 250, right? In the 250,000 on the
Yes.
fund. This year, we're using 400,000. So what happens next year? We only will have 250,000 to add.
That's true.
Yeah.
I just maybe take a second to go back to the original budget, so to speak, that we're looking at tonight, the one that shows a 3.2% increase, budget to budget, with a 10.4% increase of taxes. I think that, first of all, it's worth pointing out that on a home worth $314,000, apparently at 10.4, the additional taxes that would become the obligation of the homeowner would be $414 for the entire year. If you were to reduce your budget.
4,414. Did you say 4,000?
Well, I'm saying you would add,
No, it's
it's
$414.
Increase.
Oh,
additional dollars.
okay,
Less
so-
than
sorry.
$40
Right.
a month.
Additional.
And if you were to go to the far right, which is the lowest of these options, which is a 5.5%, which you would go from a budget increase of 3.2 to 1.0, even in that situation, the increases of taxes on the same home is $219. So the difference between the two is around $200 for the entire year. It's worth noting that. It's also worth noting that your budget increases over the last several years, while your enrollments have been steady, have gone up by increases due to legitimate salary raises and very favorable insurance rates. That's what, right, that's what's, you've been steady across with enrollment, you've been steady across with cost increases, and what's been going up and up is the tax increase, all because you're losing every year a considerable amount of state support for public schools here in Cape Elizabeth. That's what this is all about. And I could appreciate if as a taxpayer, that if I thought that each and every year my taxes were going up 10%, that my gosh, in about 9 years, it's doubled, or roughly, right? I go, oh my gosh. But first of all, it hasn't happened every year. And the only reason it is happening is because of a very dysfunctional and unpredictable formula and process for funding public education here in Maine. That's what's driving all this. And I would hope that at some point, the citizens of Maine, not just Cape Elizabeth, would say, this is unacceptable. I mean, that to me is where frustration should be channeled. And I guess that what I wonder about out loud is to shave $200 a year off my tax bill, is that a good deal for what we would lose to get to that point? I mean, how does that sound? I mean, I think that most people, and not just people with children in schools here, but people in general would say, that's not a good investment. That's my hunch.
Can I follow up on what you said and ask a question?
Mhm.
In order to save that $200 a year in taxes and go to the far right column,
Mm-hmm.
am I correct in saying on Tuesday, you mentioned it would be losing 8 or 9 teachers / administrators?
No.
No,
No, I said it would be an additional.
an additional, on top of that original list, which
Right.
already had part-time and some full-time teachers.
Right.
And bringing our CIP, our capital improvement plan, from what it was $1 million 2 years ago, down to $250,000.
That's right.
So that's practically nothing to upkeep these schools,
That's right.
among other things. You also, I think, if I'm correct, mentioned that if we were in the far right column, we would be losing programs.
We will.
And I'm not gonna quote you directly, but I think you said something along the lines of this district would not look anywhere near the district that people are familiar with here.
That's right. That's
And
not an
that
exaggeration.
It would be, maybe I'm misquoting you, but devastating to this district as.
I think it would be. I think that people, it would not feel like the district you have.
Right, so I guess I just want to reiterate what you said for the comparison. For $200 a year, to lose what we have in these schools is really important to think about. And I know one, I should say, looks at the tax rate of 10.4, and it's a scary number, and it says, oh my gosh. But when you break it up, and I'm not a mathematician, but Catherine, what is 220? What is that a month? I mean, people pay cable bills, people buy lattes.
It's less, yeah,
Um,
it's less than $20
And
a
it's for
month.
our education and the well-being of this town, and I dare say that if we don't have the district and the education that we want, as Wynn Phillips had been talking about, it's gonna be a harder place to attract really strong teachers to want to come and teach here, and our home values are gonna go, I mean, it has a much bigger rippling effect.
It does.
Huge, beyond the loss of the 8 or 9 plus the other ones at a more modest cut. So, I mean, I just think it's really important to dig beyond this scary number of 10.4, which Howard brought up. And I know I'm repeating what you said.
No.
I'm just emphasizing it,
Yep,
because I
thank
think
you.
that's hugely important to understand.
Yep.
So I'm gonna add to that, because I'm gonna go back to a couple meetings ago when Hope said, let's not focus on the green, you didn't say green, but I'm saying, let's not focus on the green number. Let's focus on the fact that year after year after year, we have had the most conservative increase and at times decrease in spending. So 3.5 this year, 2.4 last year.
Right.
3.2 the year before that, 1.3 the year before that. So keeping that in mind, you know, we have been so consistent. We have been so cautious, careful, and yet doing the best we can by trying to satisfy everybody in town in terms of, don't increase the taxes. And I'm looking at this sheet now with all the different variables of what the impact could be this year. And the first one, which is 3.2, which represents, the budget that was recommended to us by Howard, by the administrators, because this is what they believe we need, and this is not excessive, is at 3.2. It's not that much different from any other year. And then when I go all the way to the far right, which is the lowest impact to taxpayers, and I see a -1%, I feel, when I see that is not why I was voted in to school board. I wasn't voted in to make the system worse. And that's what I see when I see -1. That's what I see when I see 0.3% increase. Because at those levels, even at 2.1, at those levels, all we're doing is, we're not staying afloat. All we're doing is just moving forward with what we have to pay in terms of salaries and benefits, and then the rest of it is suffering. So my point is that I agree when Hope said a few nights ago, focus on the track record. The track record is what our increase has been, and it's been minimal to negative. And I think that's what I focus on, and this is where I think, as a member of the school board, my responsibility lies as to the taxpayers. Because if you focus on the increase, you're not seeing the bigger picture. Yeah.
I also think, and I think this is maybe to Jeff, the other two administrators aren't here, principals, and Howard, and I think Perry explained it as well, because teachers are a huge part, but custodians, maintenance, food services,
Bus drivers.
People in the technology department. I mean, to run a school district requires a lot of personnel and work behind it. And Perry has just fully explained to us that we are bare bones when it comes to custodial staff. In fact, below what is really acceptable.
Right.
And I dare say, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't think we are extravagant with the number of teachers and services that we have, that it's easy to say, oh, I'll use Spanish as an example, sorry, Sonia, but we make fun of Spanish because of me, not you. I dare say we're not going there and saying, oh, we have an extra Spanish teacher, let's get rid of Heather Altenberg. I think that we are very conservative with the number of teachers that we have here to teach the students. In fact, last year, we were trying to advocate to get more ed techs in because of the huge importance of supporting these kids at a young age so that they have what they need. So it's not frivolous. It's not like we have room to cut back without consequences.
Right.
Am I correct in saying that? Would that be accurate?
So I'd like to add another layer to just sort of put some of this in context, because people see that number of 10.4, those big increases this year, and they think to themselves, that's crazy, that's not sustainable, and we've had big increases lately. But that's not really what it's about. What's not sustainable is the continued cuts from the state that we get. We're almost to zero. That's the piece that's not sustainable. What you should be looking at, and what is sustainable in this town, is if real estate values are going up at the same rate our budget is going up, there's no change to the tax rate ever. Long run, as long as those agree, we're fine. Because if the valuations go up, and the taxes stay the same, and our budgets go up the same %, everything works out. That's what we should be aiming for, long run. If those two get out of whack long run, then you have to figure out what you want to do. And sometimes they do. Real estate values can run out, labor costs can run up, but long run, as long as they match, that's what's sustainable. As I said, what's not sustainable is state funding that goes like this and then like that. So that's the piece that's not sustainable. So, as I said before, this is not a one-year problem. we're gonna do what we can do right now to get through this, and when we come back next year, it's also gonna be likely an increase, because we're putting off stuff that we can't